Recording. Yes, that's it. Yes, it's right. So welcome to the final webinar of the year from the Wits writing program on ways of reading. So we're going to be opening a discussion about ways to help students, particularly students who weren't strong readers before, how to encourage deep reading at the moment. We're probably going to raise more questions and answers. We hope it allows everyone to think further about how to encourage deep reading. I did want to read a quote from my favorite book at the moment, which is the book I'm reading, just read, Cloud Cuckoo Land from Anthony Doerr. I know why those librarians read the old stories to you, because if it's told well enough, for as long as a story lasts, you get to slip the trap. So love of reading and ways of helping others to do so. Please put any questions that you have in the chat, and we'll just hear all four presenters first and have an open discussion around about 1 o'clock. We're going to start with Dr. Colette Gordan, who's the engine behind this webinar, whose particular interest at the moment is in annotation. And then she'll be followed by Carrie Timlin, who was Dr. Gordan's writing fellow and has now taken the annotation as a teaching strategy into other courses. And her scholarly interests are in international socialism, modernism, and British women's writing. So Colette and Carrie, over to you.
Okay, I'm going to share screen. Let's hope this works.
So glad you could make it. We struggle keeping to time, which is why we created these electronic versions of ourselves to talk you through. Yeah, please give us any questions because we'll be available through the session to queue up answers, although we might not type them to not distract people too much. Save them for later.
Okay, shall we get started?
Please.
Okay, can everyone see my screen? Great.
Yeah.
Universities have a vital social role to play in creating critical readers, an urgent role given the consensus emerging that the internet is eroding deep reading. While universities have invested quite heavily in the important work of supporting students' writing, less attention has been paid to supporting students' reading. And this is unsurprising. Reading is quite simply less visible than writing, most often becoming visible through writing or through verbalization. In universities, reading has historically been something that students do, if they do it, in isolation, outside of the classroom and out of sight of their lecturers and peers. Lecturers in general do not pay much attention to reading, which is comparatively taken for granted in teaching and learning programs, something that happens silently, that is expected to happen silently in the background. This despite the fact that reading represents probably the majority of time on task in humanities subjects, the lion's share of the labor that students are doing, and that this work of reading, largely unsupervised and unsupported, is fundamental to learning, what students are expected to do and need to do independently before they can learn. Students who struggle academically may labor through reading alone with little reward and large expenditure of time, or of course they might choose strategically not to read for courses where possible, to wait until material has been presented to them and familiarity makes reading easier or unnecessary. This presents a particular problem in my discipline of literary studies, In English departments, it is common to hear lecturers complaining that students don't read. In fact, students do read. They just read the notes, most often the spark notes, not the lecture notes, and often instead of the assigned text. These generic online resources are more popular than, for example, university lectures, designed specifically for specific students, because they can substitute for reading. They are designed to deliver extracted content, which allows the student to save time reading and focus on writing essays. How much it matters that students engage primarily with the specific text, rather than gaining information from other sources, will vary from discipline to discipline and in different situations. But we've probably all experienced the frustration of asking a question in class and trying and failing to get students in the class to look at the text in front of them and not at the lecturer. More recently, the lecturer's face on a screen. Even in a physical classroom, with physical copies of a physical text in physical hands, it can be surprisingly difficult to focus students on the text. The pandemic and remote learning have made us more keenly aware of the negative impact of isolation on students. Students evidently do not thrive working in isolation, and reading condemns students to a lot of time spent working alone, subject to anxiety, distraction, and doubt. But there are other ways of reading. While people have been worrying about the decline in reading, there is also some evidence that reading today is alive and social. Researchers at the University of Basel tracked the reading habits on the social reading platform Wattpad and found over 100,000 stories written in over 50 languages being shared every day, predominantly by young readers. What's called social reading isn't new. Your Mum's Book Club is a form of social reading. But the digital space has enormously expanded the space for social reading, allowing readers to share and comment on text. On Wattpad, for example, specific sentences in stories will draw hundreds of comments. Open Web Annotation, OWA, promises to allow the whole of the web to be read and annotated by users of the internet. Users of the open source annotation tool Hypothesis have to date posted more than 20 million annotations. 5 million of them comments on scholarly sites. The platform's annotations doubled from 10 to 20 million during the first year of the pandemic, significantly driven by online and blended learning. If it's a big if, the internet gave us the flipped classroom, online annotation makes it possible for students to read together, to extend the learning space beyond formal class time. As I see it, social annotation addresses some key problems in teaching. I just highlight 3 of these. First, addressing the common complaint that students will look everywhere except at the text in front of them. Online annotation allows teachers to fashion a text-focused classroom and learning space, open to students both inside and outside of formal class time. Then, second, by allowing students to personalize the text, to insert themselves in the margins and shape a personalized artifact. Annotation also restores a sense of the physical, tactile text, even perhaps some sliver of haptic memory that is lost in the move to online and blended learning, and even in face-to-face learning, where more and more students are accessing texts in electronic form. Most importantly, third, annotation makes peers present in the text as co-annotators, addressing the isolation of reading and the absence of feedback. So how does this look put into practice? Well, it can look quite different depending on the choices you make. I taught my first class using social annotation a decade ago, when the technology was far more basic. This year, I designed and co-taught a writing intensive seminar with Carrie Timlin as writing fellow, which focused on annotating Renaissance plays using hypothesis canvas integration, that is integration into Ulvazi. We presented on some of the challenges and pitfalls of that process in a presentation for the Teaching and Learning Conference. Since then, though Carrie has been experimenting with social annotation in her own teaching, tweaking the formula, and the results are really exciting.
In my third-year elective course, South African Feminist Literature, students were divided into two groups, with each group annotating a different story from Nkosazana and Graba's Running and Other Stories. Hypothesis would have been my preferred medium for the assignment. It's clean, intuitive, and accessible, but it isn't really available at Wits. So instead, I used Google Drive, which wasn't ideal, but proved adequate for the assignment and to test the efficacy of annotation as a teaching and learning tool for engaging with other types of literature, so novels and short stories. I also expanded on the social side of social annotation to include breakout room sessions in BBB as part of the process. In their annotations, students argued productively, shared ideas, challenged or expanded on each other's interpretations, and encouraged each other. By the deadline, they had produced nuanced analyses of their respective short stories. Individually, their confidence grew, improving their writing, and their interpretations of the text were far more creative and interesting than their analyses of the given novel in the essay that they wrote at the close of the first quarter. Notably, students who had performed poorly in the essay improved significantly in their annotations. As such, I initiated a conversation in class and asked students to fill out a survey to map their experiences using social annotation for the first time. For the sake of brevity, I've chosen quotes from the survey that best represent the overall and overwhelmingly positive response to the assignment. All the students who filled in the survey or participated in the class discussion agreed that social annotation improved their experience of the text as a reader. They also agreed that reading together and sharing ideas was their favorite part of the process. When asked which of the course assignments they learned the most from, once again, social annotation came out on top. When asked how social annotation compared to essay writing, the overall sentiment can be summarized in this response from one of the survey forms. My thought process isn't restricted. I don't need to rely on external articles. I'm able to share what I think, be corrected by my peers, research what I don't understand. With essay writing, the first thing I do is read articles to get ideas, and this is very limiting. I'm not given the space to think for myself and engage with the text because I'm so worried about whether I'm right or wrong, if I'm on the right track. Essays force me to be dependent on the works of others before thinking about the text myself. When asked if social annotation could improve essay writing skills, all students responded yes. When asked how, one student summed it up like this: I can jot down ideas while reading. There's more clarity. I'm able to review my thoughts and make links. Here's another student's perspective. In essay writing, it's a single stance, usually acquired from literature. Here it could be multiple interpretations of the single stance, which can improve your take as a whole and make it more nuanced. Let's read one more for good measure. Once we're done with the annotations, we have multiple perspectives from our classmates, and this enhances our understanding of the text rather than only having a single perspective. The impression that I got from the enthusiasm that students expressed after the assignment was that they felt empowered to rely on their instincts, make decisions, and express themselves freely. This was something that they struggled with in class because they believed that there were right answers to right questions and that they were somehow unable to figure this out, instead relying on me to provide both. This is not how class sessions were structured. I wanted them to think freely and critically and to engage with me and with each other. The tension between what they thought they were supposed to do and what they were encouraged to do limited their ability to fully participate in their own learning, something which social annotation made possible. Once they had completed the assignment, they participated more frequently and more productively in class discussions.
When you shared these with me, I was really blown away. I was impressed, and if I'm honest, maybe also a little surprised. Not by the content of the feedback. This is exactly how I imagined annotation working in seminars and why I turned to teaching with social annotation. And not by the success you had with your class. I know how much thinking and planning went into this. I was surprised only because of how we struggled together over a whole semester to get students to learn through social annotation rather than falling back on old habits. Although we had some success, it was very hard won. And we spent so much time during and after the course combing over what had and hadn't worked and trying to think of alternatives, what could be done differently. And although we had a lot of ideas, we weren't sure what, if anything, would be the fix, or even if there was a fix. And I remember at the time that you tried out social annotation, you'd been having some difficulties with the class, and you weren't super optimistic.
The students were becoming despondent. They had end of semester fatigue, so it was a gamble. But I was able to draw on what we'd learned in your course and apply it. It was also a gamble leaving students to their own devices in the annotations, so annotating without me present, monitoring and responding to their work. There was no guarantee that it would work, but it did. So those hours spent strategizing paid off. The biggest gamble was ultimately leaving the annotation space open entirely to or for the students and not annotating myself.
Someone looking at this feedback might think that social annotation just works. You take the text, you add the app and students, and voila, the class runs itself. This is definitely an idea that big edtech companies are selling, particularly the platforms that promise to automate the process, managing huge courses, motivating students to annotate, gamifying, collecting data, even assessing and grading them. But I think that would be misleading. Although you tried to minimize lecturer presence, and that was really important to what you were doing, and although the annotation space did pretty much run itself once you had it set up, a lot of thinking and work went into how you introduced social annotation to students and how this fitted in with the course more broadly.
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, the actual process only worked because we used a combination of technologies, not just annotation software, which speaks back to your point about misconceptions that students will naturally use educational technology as intended by the developer.
So to be clear, which specific technologies?
So it was the breakout rooms in BBB on Canvas. They turned out to be really important for the process. What I did effectively was divide the students into two groups and give them time in class to use their breakout rooms to decide on the short story that they would like to annotate, discuss it, and identify areas where they felt more research was needed to expand their engagement with the text. They were then given access to a PDF of their chosen story in Google Drive and time to annotate it over the course of 2 further class sessions, so it was quite time restricted. The document was also available to them outside of class time until the end of the second class session. In the first session, they used the breakout rooms to discuss the story while annotating to get a feel for the process. They then, and surprisingly with little prompting, went away and annotated on their own, working through the story, mapping reader response, and analyzing passages. In the second and final session, they returned to their breakout rooms, this time only checking in with each other to provide encouragement and to occasionally debate points before returning to their annotations, where they replied to each other and added to their individual analyses. I was also present in the breakout rooms, providing encouragement and guidance where it was necessary. But to promote a sense of ownership of the text, I didn't respond to their annotations directly. This was their space to explore and engage.
It seems like there were two things here that really made the difference. And the first, the one you just mentioned, is you keeping out of the annotations. This was really a pitfall for me teaching with social annotation. We entered the annotation space together in my course as hopeful annotators and co-readers, and we tried to model best practice and encourage students to read and comment on each other's work, assuming that this would create a sense of equal collaboration with all of us working alongside each other. Instead, I think what we found was that students gravitated more to lecturer comments and often ignored comments from their peers, or they just posted banal confirmatory responses to each other, rather than looking closely at the text and engaging with the substance of the points. And then the second point, the really big takeaway for me, the key that I think unlocked all of this was, as you said, a combination of live sessions and breakout rooms to get students going on annotations. Again, I had assumed that students would start reading and annotating individually, and this would lead naturally into class discussion, right? So go home, read, annotate, and then we'll work together. They would see and engage with each other in the document, and the real-time feedback would create a sense of liveness that would be enough to motivate them. But instead, it seems that when we taught, they froze right at the start of that process. And then it was really hard to unfreeze them.
It was. Instead of annotating regularly and responding to each other, they seemed to avoid the annotation space and then rush through annotations just before the deadline. And when we asked them to annotate live together during class time, they just didn't show up in the document. And it didn't help that they were focused on our annotations.
Right. And then by you having them in the class simultaneously writing and discussing verbally, that changed everything. It seems like it's really important to make sure that students are annotating together right from the start, so that they can build interest and confidence, and so that, as you said, the lecturer can take a back seat. The breakout room allowed students to bounce ideas off each other before committing them to writing, and to revise and take real-time feedback. And it also allowed the lecturer to comment and give feedback without writing in the annotation space. And I know that that's a point that's come up a lot in our discussions.
I was basically doing exactly what we did when we used social annotation in your course, except instead of responding to them in the annotations, I was present should they need me in the breakout rooms. The annotations, importantly, remained a space solely for the students. I think they felt like it was their space, and that was important to them.
And the time pressure definitely helped, right? As we discussed, we saw something similar when we had run a debate before, also using breakout rooms so that students could write and discuss simultaneously. Could write in a document while also chatting, while also using their microphones. This was the first time we saw students really engaging properly with each other's writing across the class, when they were talking about it in real time. And I remember we thought that perhaps it was the competitive nature of the debate, maybe even in-group, out-group dynamics, an enemy making friends of them. But your annotation exercise didn't have a competitive element.
Yeah, this was interesting. It wasn't competitive, but the social aspect didn't work on its own. There was the combination of that time-pressured environment. The assignment only ran over 2 days, and the social aspect. Because they had so little time and they wanted to engage with each other, they went away and annotated by themselves between the class discussions so that they could jump right into commenting on their peers' annotations and respond to the comments on their own. They were motivated and excited to have those conversations and debates.
So it was anticipation that drove them.
Yes, and I think a sense of community.
You mentioned that you used Google Drive, although you would have preferred to have used Hypothesis.
So this is important. It would be easy to assume that all annotation software works in the same way, but it really doesn't. The particular software used has the potential to make a huge difference to how the text is experienced by the students. So while Google Drive worked okay for what we were doing, it had its pitfalls. The annotations tend to pile up, making it difficult to locate the specific passages that they're referring to if the document is heavily annotated. As I'm sure you can imagine, this made marking impossible and would be even worse with a longer text. Another problem was that the students had to follow too many steps to access it. So emails, annotating in Drive instead of Docs, they would then accidentally end up in Docs only to find that they couldn't annotate. It was also difficult for students who were working on their phones to see their classmates' annotations and the text simultaneously, even though there is a Google Drive app. Hypothesis is much easier for students to use, especially when it's integrated into Canvas. All they have to do is click on a link and it takes them directly to the text that they're annotating.
Yeah, I was actually really impressed that you managed to get your students through all of those steps to set up something. So obviously that makes it a lot easier for students. How about for you as a lecturer?
From a lecturer's perspective, you can grade the annotations using Speed Grader in Hypothesis, which makes such a difference. It collects each student's annotations in one place so that you can review them independently of their classmates. You can also see where they've replied to or interacted with their peer annotations. In Google Drive, I had to work systematically from one annotation to the final annotation and try and figure out exactly which passages they belong to.
Right. So you're not able to like look at one student's
no.
contribution, separate that. You're having to essentially work through the entire document, which gets difficult for a large group, for example.
It really does, and a long text. Yeah. But it was the best I had without access to Hypothesis. And it was, and ended up being the lesser of two evils, the other being Perusall, which I've heard works really well in some disciplines, but is a nightmare for literary studies.
Yeah, I remember our collective unease, maybe our collective horror when we tried to open something in Perusall and think about using that for teaching. I think maybe this is best illustrated visually. So here is Billy Collins' poem Marginalia. And what we've done is annotate this in two platforms, Hypothesis over here, annotations, and in Perusall. Now, it's the same annotations, exactly the same annotations, and the same basic process. You highlight the text, and you annotate and post that. But actually, these are quite different platforms, quite different tools. And I think understanding the difference is important to understanding how they work and how it feels to work with them. Hypothesis is open web annotation. So what that means is it's like a layer of peer commentary over the whole of the internet. Any page that you put online, you can access this layer of commentary. You do that through an extension. Here, Hypothesis 54 annotations. You click on that, and it loads up in Hypothesis with these highlights and a ribbon here for all the annotations that have been made. One can scroll through. Perusall is not a layer in this way. It is its own website. So the PDF is stored and opened up inside the Perusall website, which functions as a whole kind of mini LMS with its own functionality, very much framing the text. You can minimize the stuff, which I find pretty overwhelming. Get rid of that, get rid of all of this LMS stuff, and have, I think, a slightly easier access to the text. But then when you open it up, obviously it gets pushed in and the conversation opens up on the side. This is the full conversation. I think the big difference for me, the biggest difference between the two, is how the text is positioned. And this comes back to the fundamental difference between these as OWA, a layer of annotation on one side, and an embedding site on the other side. Hypothesis is very much text-centered. So the text doesn't move. Here is the text just as it would display on the website, which we directly annotated. There are the annotations. They don't interfere with it. Whereas in Perusall, these tools actually tend to squash the text, which becomes here a lot smaller, in fact, than the discussion going on. And my sense of the two platforms is that while Hypothesis is text-centered, it really centers the text, centers your attention on the text. Perusall tends to center attention on its tools and its algorithms more. Carrie, I wondered about your sense of the two platforms.
So something you didn't mention is these are two of 3 or 4 platforms that we've tried out, and these seem to be the two that are the most popular or that most people are using. I've already mentioned that Google Drive was okay, but not great. I like Hypothesis because it centers the text, and if you don't mind going back to that window, the annotations are easily seen, they're easily accessible. So if you scroll down, you can see every single annotation neatly applied to the person who wrote it. You can see which bit of the text without even clicking on it and going directly to it. So you can see my thumb as a bookmark. You can see trying to imagine what the person must look like. So you know what it's referring to, and you can then click on that specific annotation and it'll single out that annotation. So it's a much simpler and a much more accessible user interface. Perusall is overwhelming. If you look at those annotations, if I was a student coming in and wanting to see what people had said, that looks like one giant box of text.
I think it's also worth saying that a big appeal of Perusall, and with recent news about next year's teaching, I was sorely tempted to say, just give students Perusall, because it can sort them into groups and it can basically grade their annotations. Perusall can't read, it can't read tone, but it does have an algorithm that will give a very rough idea of how much students have engaged with the text. The concern, though, is that it encourages students to kind of work until they get their kind of 10 out of 10. They've done enough and then stop. And something I like about Hypothesis is it's kind of endless. It's just a tool for exploring. So I think there's real appeal for people who are having to teach massive courses, huge numbers of students, where you just want students to engage a bit with the text and chat with each other, versus what you and I might want to do, where we want to get a group of students looking very closely together at a text and also be there in the text with them. I find it very enabling, actually, being able to see in a detailed way, get a better idea of how students read.
And this is where it would be incredibly interesting to hear from people in other disciplines who've used platforms like Perusall, find out their experience of it compared to our experience of it, using it in literary studies.
Yeah, and I think my biggest question for people would be how, what would work in your discipline? Would something like Perusall be better for your discipline? Do you foresee problems? Would you foresee problems using something like Hypothesis? Essentially, how might reading be different in your disciplines that makes the practice of annotation perhaps different?
Thank you very much. Fascinating. Right, so we'll hear the other presentations and then we'll have a full conversation at about 1 o'clock. And we will return to some of these comments in the chat. Next presenter is Dr. Sarah Godsell, who lectures history in the School of Education, is a published poet, and her current scholarly interests include aspects of decolonization and critical pedagogies. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. And that's a really amazing presentation to follow up on. I'm busy sharing my screen. I want to pre-apologize for my PowerPoint slides. I feel like when I was, and I'll explain this a little bit in the presentation, but when I was building these PowerPoint slides, I've just hit my quota for making like properly legible and pretty and engaging PowerPoint slides this year. And I'm kind of, year-end burnout, and they will be functional, but they're not. They have too many words, and I'm pre-apologizing for that. Okay, so sorry, there's an echo. Does somebody have their microphone on? Okay. So in this presentation, I'm going to be talking through 3 different courses that I did that I had different engagements with reading in, and I'm mainly thinking about reading as so it's reading as beings, writing as bodies, reading and writing as humanizing in this online ERT space that we're operating in. Sorry, can you see the slide changing on your screen? Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay, so just as a kind of jumping off point for where I'm thinking about, I'm using this quote by Yvette Abrams that's drawn from the book Surfacing. And Yvette Abrams' piece is called Bringing Water to Krotoa's Garden, Decolonization as Direct Action. And she writes about centimeter by centimeter, my body begins to feel decolonized. Brain cell by brain cell, I begin to appreciate just how deeply I have been colonized. And this was a quote that I used as an essay prompt for my Issues in History Education honors course. But it was a prompt to think about how, especially when we're looking at readings and thinkings about decolonization, it's often very limited to kind of brain realm, and how across these different courses in different ways, I wanted to engage the students as complete beings, but also as bodies in terms of reading and of writing. And then I always draw on Freire as a kind of touchstone. So reading is not walking on the words, it is grabbing the soul of them. And what I experienced during this year particularly, even more than last year, was that reading was, and the previous presentation spoke a little bit about this, and this is a kind of a common complaint, but reading as being more and more a utilitarian thing, that essays are, that readings are mined for the correct information to put down in an essay when the student has to do the reading for that essay, and that the processes of kind of reading and thinking and reading and writing were even more curtailed in an online space. And so what I'm going to do in this presentation, just like a couple of things about me here. I'm interested in ways of reading and writing that particularly foster historical understanding and humanity. So I am a historian. I'm based in history at Wits School of Education, but as history is a discipline that's based in reading, I'm interested in exploring different kinds of ways to bring different kinds of readings into the classroom, to engage learners, particularly first and second years, in the ideas of what can be important and powerful in history, rather than just an idea of history being a reading discipline where you, again, mine the readings for facts. And in terms of reading this year, when I was speaking to Pam about, when I was first thinking about this presentation, speaking to Pam about it, it felt overwhelmingly like a failure in terms of student reading, because in the different kinds of assessments that we did across different courses, which I'll speak about just now, we had struggled in different ways to get kind of basic reading engagements, which we had, which in other years hadn't been quite as hard, even though reading is always a challenge. And it felt like the students were moving into more kind of isolated spaces with themselves and the internet. And I'm using the internet in that broad sense, as you know, there are inevitably some students in first year who put Google as a source in their reference list. But so that the readings that we provided them, which were supposed to provide the kind of scaffolding for the concepts we were working with, and which was supposed to provide the content, but the historical thinking skills as well, that those were not seen as things that could help, but they were seen as things that kind of got in the way of the students writing what they needed to write in their essays to pass. And then obviously this kind of resulted in very bad marks. So some of this presentation is thinking through that. And then this is just this was really touched on very interestingly in the previous presentation. So thinking about reading as an individual activity. So why did losing the collective spaces of lectures and in-person tutorials matter so much? And I think what the thoughts about annotation that have been provoked from the last presentation could really speak to that. So there are 3 courses that I'm going to speak about. The first one is an honors course in Issues in History Education. It's a very small course. There were only 6 students, and the module that I taught was half a semester, and I constructed this course very carefully around readings that I was very excited about, that I found very provoking as well as very beautiful, and that also was specifically by Black women authors. And most of the students in my class, I mean, I didn't construct it like this because of who the students in my class were, but most of the students in my class are Black women. And we spent the first class discussing what their intellectual trajectory had been in their undergrad and their honors in terms of who produces knowledge. And that most of them said that they'd either encountered maybe one or no Black women authors in their entire undergrad and their honors up to this point degree, which obviously is concerning. But I mean, it also, this wasn't a kind of essentializing exercise. What it was supposed to do was to create the idea from the beginning of the course, from that conversation, of the kind of reading and writing and knowledge producing and knowledge consuming and knowledge interacting process as embodied. But it didn't work. And I mean, I think part of this is year end and burnout. But there were still honors students engaged in a course that they needed to pass for their degree. But and they in the first class, they'd been very excited about the readings and about the thinking that we were going to do. And then they didn't read for the rest of the 7 weeks. And then when they came to do their essay, we were doing some writing exercises drawn from that Yvette Abrams piece. And in the essay, I really asked them to think about decolonization as an embodied space, and to think about that through the readings that they'd done, which spoke to very different aspects of history and history education and decolonization. And all of them except one completely just avoided the idea of reading and writing and producing knowledge as embodied, because one of the things that I'd asked them to do from that quote was think about, what does decolonization feel like in your body, and how is this interacted with your honors process, but also with your process with these readings, as a kind of lead into then exploring the intellectual work from a grounded space. And I found that the kind of, and the other thing that was interesting about the readings that they engaged in, that they didn't engage, the fact that they had been not reading throughout the course, and then when it was time for the essay, then they chose 2 or 3 or whatever was the kind of minimum requirements. But also the reading that their essay quote was drawn from, the Yvette Abrams reading, is a reading that's in a very different tone to the other readings that we've done in the course. It's less dense. It's describing processes of decolonization, speaking about what people put on their skin, what the ways in which the earth is formed, the ways in which we question power in very different ways in different aspects of living our lives. And the students all completely avoided that piece. It was a short piece. It was 6 pages long. It was very straightforward to read, but they were so unsettled by it being in a different genre, and asking them to think about kind of knowing in a different way, that they just didn't engage with it. And so that for me was also a kind of sign of failure in this course, because of what I'd wanted to do in terms of kind of reading and knowing, and the idea of these being embodied acts. So then the second course that I'm going to speak about briefly, I am watching my time, Pam. So the second course that I'm going to speak about is a writing intensive course. It's a course about the French and the Haitian revolutions. It's a first year course, and first years really struggle to engage with these topics because they are perceived as very, very irrelevant, and especially the French Revolution. And you know, it's very easy to understand why it's seen as very irrelevant. So we bring in the Haitian Revolution much more, but we also try and really focus the course on the historical argumentation, on ideas around argumentation, and how kind of thinking in history needs to happen, and how that is put across in different readings and different types of readings. So what we did this year was to focus on historical storytelling. And we gave the students extracts of some historical fiction, as well as the extracts from the normal kind of content readings that we give them, and the concept readings that we give them. And we asked them for their essay, rather than to write an essay about one aspect or other of the French Revolution or the Haitian Revolution, to choose a person or to create a fictional character in those revolutions, and to choose a moment and to narrate the moment through that person. And so what we were really asking them to do here was to read not just for the historical content, to read for what the content meant for people. So again, it's the kind of idea of humanizing readings and humanizing the readings, and humanizing the writing. And it was also interesting that we scaffolded the students very carefully in this task. We had 4 tutorial exercises leading up to it, where we explored historical argumentation, where we explored storytelling, where we explored narrative, where we explored historical fiction. And again, most students didn't, they misunderstood the task, or they were not able to disconnect from a kind of historical content view. A lot of them gave overviews of the French or Haitian Revolution. But what was interesting, and you know, maybe, I mean, there's reflections we can do about maybe how we scaffold the specific readings with them. But what was interesting from this was that the people who hadn't performed well in other aspects of the course were often those who really excelled. So I'm just going to read an excerpt from one of the essays. And this essay is actually really sadly from a student who hasn't submitted anything else throughout the course, including the exam, but submitted this beautiful story. So they write, "I began my day like any other and walked to work. The sun was not blazing, it was covered in clouds. This was in our favor, as we were all already heated by our determination. We entered the plantation, received our tools as usual, but the moment the signal rung, the fury of our ancestors was unleashed. I was terrified, but I was more so tired of the cruelty and the shame that we'd been forced to endure. We had won this battle. It was obvious, and although lives were lost, we still had hope that our message had gotten across to not only our masters, but also to the people like my father, who had given up the idea of freedom. The message being that we were powerful and we would take back our freedom. Months have passed since the first revolt. A crowd had gathered to stare up at the bodiless head of Boukman that had been stuck cruelly onto a wooden pole as the flames on the ground burnt his body first and traveled higher and higher. From a distance, we could see a few Grand Blancs triumphantly watching as the crowd grew, and shouts of anger and screams of heartache cut the open area. In that moment, I knew that they thought they had won, but they underestimated how hot our blood boiled. They would know soon enough." And that's really, I mean, it's such the whole essay is such a nuanced, beautiful idea of thinking through a specific slave with a specific positionality, with a specific kind of family, and how they experienced the fight for freedom and this particular moment. So it's kind of thinking about the reading and the writing that went into this is tricky when this person specifically hasn't submitted anything else for the course, hasn't accessed anything else to in a way that lets them participate in an academic program. So those are the kind of things that I'm still thinking about from that. And I think that I'm out of time, so I'm not going to really go into detail in the last course. I'll just end up with kind of 2 questions. So the last course is a 4th year method course, and I'm using podcasts as a supplement to readings. There was a series of podcasts that I recorded, and the students' exams are they're required to record their own podcast. And the idea with this, when I'm thinking about reading, is to find ways to shift the relationship to reading so that you're producing knowledge in different modalities and you're consuming knowledge in different modalities, and that is intimately tied to the readings because that's part of the course. But what also was important with this course is that the people who were interviewed in the podcasts were all close to the students in different ways. So they're either ex-students who are now teaching, or they are students who are postgrad students, and so exploring ideas of decolonization and of history in their postgrad degrees. And with those students especially, it was great because they've produced, so I could prescribe their master's theses, I could prescribe papers that they're working as part of the reading. And this was the course where there was a little bit of a success, that this did shift students' attitudes towards themselves as knowledge producers. And it took some work because often when they were submitting the pre-tasks to the podcasts, they would be referring to work by these people who were in the podcasts, like published academic work, but not referencing it properly, or not referring to it as academic work. And so we had to go through a process of speaking about who these people are who are producing knowledge, and that it is in the same kind of academic space as all of the other readings that they're doing. But I mean, it was an interesting process. So it just makes me think about the different aspects of knowledge and knowing, and like consuming and producing knowledge that are tied so intimately to reading and to writing, but also then thinking about, as the previous presentation said, the different ways in which students are in the world and are kind of reading and producing things. So what I wanted to speak about a little bit, thinking about failure, as in Jack Halberstam's The Queer Art of Failure, where we can try and undo some of the power knots around knowledge and what they refer to as high theory. But maybe we can speak about that in the questions. But what I just wanted to end off with was this meme that one of my students sent me when we were doing the French Revolutions course, which obviously was like horrifying because, we don't want to be seen as lecturers who are just standing around watching our students get executed. But that they had done a specific reading of power dynamics in the French Revolution and read that onto the power dynamics in the course. And so it's pushing me to kind of look at different places for where students are doing their reading. And I guess that's also what part of the previous presentation was saying as well. Okay, thank you.
Many thanks. I'm really enjoying these presentations. I think it's extremely interesting, and there is a continuity from social reading and annotation and embodied reading and connecting reading to the world and to peer-led groups, to our final speaker. Sorry, Fouad, but I think actually you do connect to all these issues. So Mr. Fouad Asfour will speak now. He lectures history of art and is a senior writing fellow in the Writing Center, specializing in postgraduate writing groups. And I believe his scholarly interests are in decolonizing academic writing. So over to you, Fouad.
Yeah, thank you, Pamela, and thanks also to the speakers. This was all very exciting, and lots of what was said I really take deep interest in, and would like to, I'm very happy to be part of this discussion. Thank you for inviting me. So, as Pamela said, I'm currently sessional lecturer teaching second year history of art courses. And there are lots of questions of decolonizing the curriculum. And at the same time, I'm also facilitating postgraduate writing groups with the Writing Center, which is really a very enriching exercise. So I prepared something which is a bit of an experiment, and thanks for Sarah to give the cue of thinking about failure. So I will try to practice something that can deeply fail. It hasn't been exercised at all, but let's try this. I hope you can hear me and see everything that's happening. So in this short presentation, what I want to do is basically reflect on the context of the challenges which we were discussing as lecturers of the History of Art course in the Wits School of Art, where we are facing the need to transform and decolonize the curriculum, obviously. And our question basically was, how can we make the course not only more relevant in terms of updating it to contemporary art, but also how can we transform it in terms of the transformation in South Africa and knowledge in since '94. So I titled this talk Embodied Reading as Place-Based Learning, where I want to ask how can we decolonize reading and activate study as multimodal processes in teaching and learning. This is really motivated again by the fact that most writing in art history, and I'm sure Sarah can speak to that as well, and I'm happy to hear that you are discussing Haitian Revolution, which we also draw on, and Troyot, is that art historical writing has been basically eclipsing, denying, and writing out of the curriculum African art practices. So faced with this challenge, we as staff discussed how can we get the students to think of the context, which means it's a double reading. Students have to read the text both when it comes to modernity, which is the topic of the course, from the perspective of the writer and in context of the current South Africa today. So as a preparation, we did a writing as thinking workshop. And in this context, I proposed we could draw from Ugandan design and art educator Kito Wintergreen, who published in 2019 the text Wandering About, an experiment in walking and learning, where he invited students to go through Kampala, look at texts written by Margaret Trowell, who is the founder of the school in Kampala, and then to reflect how does this relate. Another influential text for me is by Palestinian educator Munir Fashe, who is interviewed in a recent issue by Sociology of Education by Maysoon Sukaria. The paper is called Decolonizing Education, A View from Palestine, where Munir Fashe also outlines how a community place-based education shifts the way how we look at text, how students read text, how teaching can happen. And lastly, I'm also drawing from Toronto-based educational scholar Ruben Gastambide Fernandez, who asked really important questions on cultural production. The one text which I brought into discussion there was why the arts don't do anything towards a new vision for cultural production in education. So why do I mention all these texts is that these really try to shift the view on how can we make the material that students study more relevant, while obviously locating the research, which is our task as lecturer, in a scholarly discussion, including previous writing and and engaging in a real discussion between existing writing and the critical review, updating, and decolonizing of the curriculum. So we decided that we will ask students to take notes, handwritten notes, take photo of the notes during the course, and use that towards the final essay they were expected to write. In our discussions with the colleagues, we basically raised these kind of questions: how to contextualize reading and teaching and learning, how to make reading more relevant for students, and how we can expand what is a text, what is writing, and what is reading in this context. Another resource which I'm always kind of raising with students, another thought which I raise with students to make them aware that reading is an activity, is the text by Paulo Freire, The Act of Study, where he posits that basically the reader updates the text every time a text is read. The text is recreated every time a person reads the text and engages with it in terms of creating new knowledge. And that's where I think the annotation mentioned by Colette and Carrie is really an important and relevant exercise, because it takes students to the realm of engaging with the writer, the text, and really taking it seriously that there was someone behind the act of writing the text, so that reading, like Pam summarized so nicely, becomes something that is embodied in the sense that it has been written and is now being read again. So we faced a number of critical interventions in terms of, is this not too much for second-year students? Can we really overburden them with these kind of complex questions? But I felt that students actually expected that. So last year when I was teaching the same course, it was the same experience, that basically students already came to class with a very specific knowledge, with very specific questions, with very specific urgencies, asking the university space to provide a space to be able to discuss those. So we must, I now need to add also that most of the students are fine arts students, and there is a highly activist and critical space in terms of engaging with critical social context and making art. And so in this context, I really found it very encouraging that the department was so open to for us to do these experiments and to raise these kind of questions, and to also address with students the question how reading can become an activity that is actually actively relates to topics, which speaks to embodied knowledges and spaces. So what I basically asked students is to go do take a walk, and I must also add here that this is a problematic concept, a problematic activity in South Africa, obviously, due to violence, gender-based violence, and that it's not for everyone easy to actually walk physically out in the public space. So I framed it in a way as a metaphorical walk, and students could basically choose how they wanted to walk, how they would engage with the writing. One student, for example, said, let me walk through the footnotes, and because noting that one of the texts was heavily footnoted, and really created a walk through footnotes, engaging in a deep reading with the text. And it was really a very, very amazing experience to see how students translated this concept of walking through their room even, or through their literature, or through their curriculum. And I felt in a way that this kind of exercise really helped reframing the question of how to teach history of art and make it more relevant for students who are actually practicing visual artists. Yes, and I want to, I think, because it's 1:05, I want to stop here. And thank you for your attention. And please ask questions anytime. I'm happy to speak more about these. Also the details of the course.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much. Many thanks to all 4 presenters. So this is the open discussion time. Would you like to raise a hand and direct your comments to any or all of the speakers? Dimitri.
Wow. I mean, I'm just blown away. My sense is that the session is almost like an initial session for a longer symposium. That's really, what I'm feeling. But let me just see what has come up for me. I think, Sarah, that one piece from the student that you shared where the student actually wrote their experience of living into the experience of the person written about. And that for me was really powerful because of clearly there was an emotional, political connection. And what baffles me is why that emotional political connection was not ignited with, the Abrams piece from the book called Surfacing. So there's that. What I also thought was ways in which one can possibly move, across different historical moments and spaces, by, for example, working with Haiti, working with apartheid, so sort of bringing things home, but also making home part of the wider world. By working with that method in relation to apartheid. What you mentioned, Sarah, was that the Abrams piece was a different genre of writing, of a different genre of text. And what I found in the 3rd year course that I teach is that students were really inspired by my introduction of a different genre of writing right at the beginning of the course, which was, basically them writing a 6-word memoir, 6 words only, about their knowledge and experience of the concept of race, their knowledge and experience of the concept of the human. And then I used the same exercise at the end of the same course. And that was quite incredible. And what I'm thinking here is how one might combine a different genre of writing with a different genre of text. And I think that I partly did that with the extracts from Chimurenga, the curriculum is everything. And what I'm really wanting, to explore with all of you is how one can bring this different genre of text and different genre of writing together in a meaningful learning experience, which is contextualized and worldly. And I think what I'm also finding is, what's his name? I forget his name, but anyway, we did inquiry-based learning with, the man who was injured during Fees Must Fall and is now in Canada. And I can see how inquiry-based learning is actually coming into and melding with the social annotation. And I think that was in Colette and Carrie's presentation. So for me, what I see happening here is a whole range of radical pedagogical methods and praxis coming together. And I'd really like us to, David Hornsby. I'd really like us to think about how we can create a thinking space where, we can experiment with all of these, methods and praxis coming together. And then the last thing is that I would really like to learn more, that's me, to learn more about the ways in which, Carrie, Colette, and Fouad have presented, today, because I exist sort of between the technology and paper, partly because of my generation. And at the same time, I am really excited and wanting to learn more about how to work with technology. And I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Laura.
Hi, thanks so much for these very inspiring presentations. I went to the SOTL in the South conference this week, and a presenter, Vivian Bozilek, spoke about her experience during lockdown of working with a group of people, a community of practice, collaboratively using the slow reading method. And how they all read slowly together. They're working through a particularly complex series of texts on higher education development. Anyway, but what I wanted to say is that what really struck me about today is that I just on a sort of pragmatic note, and I hear what Maria and others, Sarah, are saying in the text box as well, talking with very large classes, and we've all had this issue of students just, using. We spoke about instrumental reading in a way that is really the opposite of what you were trying to say today. The sort of deep reading you were speaking about, the slow reading, the collaboration, the understanding the context of the reading, the author, and so on. And I'm just wondering how these apps, how Hypothesis, and I wanted, I suppose, to ask a question to Carrie and Colette. I think that you're absolutely right, that I think perusal almost becomes an end in itself. It's it becomes its own thing. And we've used it at the School of Education. And interesting, I mean, I'm very glad Teresa's here, because Teresa was one of the students in our course where, you know, who enjoyed using Perusall. But quite a few of the students in the course have said to us, you know, why don't you assess our annotation? And I think this raises issues around how one assesses, what criteria one uses to assess reading and annotation and engagement in this way. I mean, I think it raises so many issues for me. And are students only going to pay? Will students take it more seriously if it's more valued and if it's part of assessment? Do we go that route? It just there's so many issues, I think, you know, that have come up today, and it's just been very, very inspiring. Thanks so much. But I think that hypothesis seems to offer a way of working, of taking things to scale, of getting students. I really love the way that you didn't just allow students to, you know, on their own do the annotation, but actually created the space for them to work together. And I think that's a huge shift in the way that one can use these apps. But then we have to build them into the tutorial programs, you know, and I'm thinking how we can do that, and we can actually build that into our tutor training programs as well. So I think there are so many positive implications. So thank you very, very much. It's just really not wanting to lose the essence of that deep social reading. I'm thinking also of Marianne Wolf's work she wrote many, many years ago on the reading brain, and how she has also written about how skimming has become the new reading. When students work on, you know, do online reading, they skim, they've become very good skimmers, and how we can move, you know, really move away from that, and how it's, you know, the neural pathways are just not, the reading brain is not being developed, which is fascinating. Thanks.
Thanks, Laura. Shall we hear from Mega, and then any of the panelists want to respond to all those points?
Good afternoon, colleagues. As I said when I joined, I didn't think I should be in this space as an administrator, but it has been fascinating, absolutely fascinating listening to this. And a thought that struck me, and I'm pretty sure it has been discussed already, was that we speak of texts, and I look at when I was a student as well, but we speak of text and engaging with the text and how to get students to engage with the text. But I think we also need to think of two things. The first one is, if the text is intimidating even before the student picks up the text, what happens to the student's mindset? Because a lot of our texts are very much geared towards academic writing. And I look at our department where we have students who come from RPL students as such, who don't have the academic undergrad degree. When they come in, you're pushing them into honors or to masters, and they don't have that base as it is. And I think that's something we really need to be conscious of. And the other thing as well is the language of the text. Most of the students in our department, and I speak from Drama for Life, and very uneducated as well, is that the language is not something that they can identify with. If I struggle to read English, how do you now expect me to engage in the text? Again, I'm intimidated before I even pick up the book or I even engage in the text. So I think that's something, and I'm sure it's been discussed, and I think it's something we need to really consider when we're looking at students reading and engaging. The other point that also struck me is that with COVID being as it is, it took us all by surprise. And then what happened was that students and teachers and lecturers, mostly the academic staff, kind of threw texts online, threw things on Uwazi, on Sakai, and you just expected students to engage. We really didn't have a moment to focus and say, okay, I'm picking this text, but will a student be able to engage? Because as much as we want them to gain the knowledge of the text, of the writing, engage in the reading, you know, activate the reading brain, we can't really do that if they don't have the mechanisms themselves to do it. I mean, I'm looking at it as an administrator and not as an academic. And I think to myself, sometimes when I look at the academic text, and I have a degree and I've worked for multiple years, I sometimes am very intimidated by it. I cannot imagine what students go through. So, I mean, this conversation, and I love the walking through, like the walking concept, because that for me feels like I'm not sitting with a book, isolated, reading, and expecting to regurgitate, because I feel like that's a lot what's happening now. We copy, paste, we stick, we don't reference correctly. I'm not engaging in it, but the walking through feels like a physical activity to me. You're asking me to walk through the text, and all of a sudden I imagine a student drawing little feet or a tree with roots and leaves, and that now kind of, I think, when you engage in a visual way maybe, or in a more active way, it kind of takes away the anxiety, takes away the fear and the intimidation. So thank you so much. It was absolutely amazing. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Mega, it sounds to me like you should be teaching courses.
Right. No, I'm good with being an administrator. Thanks. But thank you for the compliment.
Right, so we've had some lovely points there. Thought about the radical pedagogies and the thinking space and the weaving across times and the writing creatively, slow reading. How do we work with large classes? How do we assess reading and annotation? And lastly, this engagement and making things real and getting rid of the fear of books. Anyone want to respond to any of those thoughts? And there's a lot of interesting things happening in the chat too. Dimitri, do you want to go?
Pamela, let me defer to Colette.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All yours, Colette.
There's something I wanted to pick up on, because I've been hearing come through in threads, and I'm so glad it came out today, which is, I hadn't thought before how much questions of authority and power are linked to this practice of extractive reading. Which I think has come out in what everyone's saying, that when students think the text is something that you mine and you turn it into that kind of single font, Ulwazi data, then you've done the job. And that is actually the end point. So the text kind of just gets thrown away, basically. And one of the interesting things that we saw with annotation, I think Sarah's seen this in her classrooms as well, is that the students who tend to resist being returned to the moment of reading are the strong students who can just write really good essays because they had the right schooling. They've been trained to do a thing, and they don't want to give up the power that goes with that. And I do feel that everyone has slightly lost their ability to attend and to listen to others in this thing about, how people are actually reading at the moment. And everyone's set to broadcast all the time. And students are asked to continually produce, the same way we are. And not to actually, I don't want to say consume, but not to attend to the thoughts of others, which is fundamentally what reading is. There's a negotiation. It's not data, it's not extracting Foucault. It's listening to that, participating in that discussion. And this is a problem that entirely predated the pandemic. This is happening, but I feel like online teaching has just accelerated it so badly. And so many of our platforms visually, kind of tactilely reinforce this stuff, this idea that students just need to extract, and also that their audience is some kind of big authority, not each other. Sorry, I was thinking actually about the thing that bothered me with perusal, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the case, but the emphasis is not on the text, but it's actually on the algorithm. You're performing to the algorithm. And I often feel like students are performing to my algorithm. Like, I'm not a real person anymore. It doesn't matter what I tell them. They're doing the thing for authority that they're expected to do. And I think it's really difficult wresting them away from that. And it's become urgent to do that. I don't know if that made sense to people, but yeah, I just really wanted to bring up that point of authority and power and how students understand reading and writing in relation to power, which is the power of the university, basically.
Of course, authority is related to authorship. Yes.
Yeah.
So Maria, Carrie, and perhaps Fouad should speak up at some point too. So Maria, would you like to go?
Thanks. Yes, this is sort of follows on very directly from what you've just been saying, Colette. Because I'm busy doing a little project where I'm looking very closely at my first year students' online writing tasks. So these are the first year students at the School of Education. So I have them for English 1, and we do poetry and a South African novel. And what I'm noticing is how, so I had writing fellows, I was giving them a weekly task. And what I'm noticing so much now when I analyze their tasks is how my question forecloses their reading. They want to please, they want to answer the question. They want to satisfy the reading. They want to satisfy the teacher, you know, especially I think as first years. And something that might be very interesting to look at would be the relationship, as you've also hinted, between the kind of school they went to and those short answer questions that they get from the CAPS curriculum for literature. And now the completely different relationship with the text that I am just trying to instill in them as a university literature teacher. And in my research journal, one of the things I wrote was, how can I design a task that doesn't close down their reading? Yeah, and I think that's such a, it's at the core of our task as literature teachers, and how to do it. Yeah, and I've been using David Rabinowitz's The Rules of Reading. They're old now, but to look at how, and one of the most powerful sort of drivers is coherence. Students want to generate a coherent reading for the teacher. And even if they don't understand 4/5 of the words in the extract or the poem, they will force everything into coherence, just so they have an answer. And so I'm very interested in your idea of the social annotation, to try to remove myself from the space so that I can get away from that terrible teacher effect that just closes everything down. Oh, fascinating. Thank you very much.
Hi, is that my cue? Something that, also just following on from this idea of authority, something that I found quite interesting with my students in their annotations is they moved into a space away from that authority. So students enter our classrooms with already existing knowledge. They have the tools that they need to analyze something. They have ideas, but we often don't hear these ideas in class because, as I mentioned, you know, we have this right question, right answer system. So what the annotations did is it took them out of that context of feeling like they were speaking to an authority, because when they were speaking to each other, they were drawing on that existing knowledge. They were drawing on what they were organically bringing into the course, different experiences, different frames of understanding, different contexts. And I think that's also where the students who don't typically do well on essays were really shining, because they weren't intimidated by the essay itself. They weren't intimidated by that narrow framework of getting the answer right, of trying to please that very authoritative audience. And then Anna, there's something in the comments I just wanted to respond to. When you said, what if authority expects them to listen to each other? The moment authority gives them any instruction, they want a rubric. So even if we're telling them to listen to each other, they're going to be going, how? What's the criteria for listening to my friend? Like, how am I going to be graded on this? Do I need to respond? So that's the short answer to that question. So I think the solution is to remove authority entirely and allow them to draw on that already existing knowledge.
Laura, Fouad, and possibly.
Okay, so I'm going to say that I think that I agree in part, but I think that it's about timing. I think that there is space for so-called authority or facilitators, lecturers to play a role. I mean, what I found, I don't know if Agata is still here, but in the master's group, when we were using Perusall, sometimes it was just something that one of the course facilitators commented on, or encouraged students to comment on each other's, or group things in a particular way, or drew connections that actually seemed to generate further discussion. But I think it is about knowing when to pull back. And I don't want to defend rubrics, but I think it is, again, and I think rubrics can flatten it completely and reduce it to a compliance exercise. But at the same time, I think those criteria, if students are engaged with them and they work with them and even produce them themselves, I think it can shift the whole power dynamic. But that's another discussion. But I think that's why I'm very, very interested in the criteria of the algorithms, because I suspect that they're very technical. I suspect that they're about, number of words and things like that. And we can shift those criteria, and it can be about deep reading and meaning, and it doesn't have to be the right answer, or agreement. But it's just that exactly what I think Pam was saying about questioning, and Colette was saying about getting students to ask those questions. Thanks.
Wonderful, and we're at 1:30. I don't know if Fouad or Sarah, you want to say anything? I must admit, I'm rather curious about what Hamish was writing. Yes, Fouad?
Thank you so much for the many, many interesting comments. One thing exactly what Hamish was writing. So I think there's a lot to be learned from drama and applied drama. Like what I try to do with students is reenacting text, performing text, and also how is the writer actually encoded in the text, the way it is written. That can make so much visible, I think. And also if you think about how Rhodes-based international relations lecturer Sipukasi Mahatla does translanguaging in the lectures. And we did a research project on that and interviewed also the students who gave amazing feedback about that performance. So I think it's also how can we pull the text into the here and now. In terms of also reenacting. Even me, I always highlight, my German accent and my strange background, and this kind of positionality, I think, also for lecturers, when lecturers speak to text and read text. There was a comment in the chat box, something about reading for, and that's, I think, really something which can inform lecturers' practice quite, and it can inspire actually students to read differently, I think.
Wonderful. Hamish and Sarah, and then we'll finish in either order.
Hi, Pamela. I hope what I wrote is self-explanatory, but if there was a follow-up question, I'm open to share some thoughts and responses to it, but if not, we can jump ahead.
All right. It sounded like a very fascinating, and Sarah has to go. All right, so we are finishing on time for once. I saw that Dimitri had a suggestion about continuing this next year. Would you be interested?
I would, definitely.
Let's maybe do it, because this has been a very extremely rich discussion, and there's of course so much to talk about. All right, so many thanks everyone, and huge thanks to the presenters for really fascinating presentations. Thank you. I'll stop the recording now.